Ladies and gentlemen, today we're talking about the fat electrician. That's because the spherical embodiment of electromagnetism has decided to school some losers on Twitter. That's right, although I do kind of disagree with his premise, but we'll get into that in a minute. So basically, the chubby electron responded to this post here. The post is a communist meme saying, making a profit from selling people's basic needs to them is taking advantage of them. Now, obviously, that's not true. As the fat electrician points out, so you want the people growing the crops to do it for free? I thought we fought a whole war to end that practice. Then this person here, freedom preacher of the South, has a controversial opinion. He says, well, you're wrong. No US war was ever fought over slavery. To which our good friend, the thick positron, responds, real. What was the Civil War over? To which the other person responds, the Union trying to force states, which attempted to leave peacefully, to stay in the Union due to the South's economy. The Corwin Amendment, passed by Republicans and supported by Lincoln, protected slavery constitutionally. And why were the states trying to leave? Our rotund friend of electricity says. To which the person responds, are you stupid? Now, anytime you immediately jump to are you stupid in an argument, it just means you don't have an argument against what they're saying. But he goes on to try to explain himself anyway. The Corwin Amendment constitutionally protected slavery. If that was the reason for the secession of the first 7 states, they could have stayed in the Union after that was passed. To which the fat electrician responds, all I did was ask why they left. You immediately attack my intelligence and then deflect rather than answer? Why don't you want to answer? I'll just ask the states themselves. They were very specific in their declarations of causes. Mississippi, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Texas, in this free government, all white men are and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights. It is an absolute social necessity that the African race be held in bondage. Now, of course, right here, he is quoting the documents that Mississippi and Texas published when they were seceding from the Union. This person says, now do Tennessee's. I got you. The systematic and persistent war upon the institution of African slavery as it exists in the southern states has produced a condition of affairs which no patriotic citizen can view without the deepest concern. Tennessee Governor Harris' formal address to Congress on the 25th of April, 1861. The Tennessee Declaration of Secession did not cite slavery, but go ahead and ignore all that about the Corwin Amendment and keep pretending like slavery was the reason. The Declaration from Tennessee didn't list any reasons whatsoever, our thick electron friend says. Does that mean they seceded for no reason? The governor and the government address to the people of Tennessee explicitly cite slavery. The Corwin Amendment protected slavery where it already existed, but the Deep South states already had seceded before it was proposed. The Corwin Amendment isn't evidence that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It's evidence that the Confederate states didn't trust the federal government to actually protect slavery, which again is why the governor and the state government of Tennessee explicitly cited slavery. So why did the public vote fail the first time in Tennessee, but not after Lincoln's call for troops? Why was West Virginia admitted to the Union as a slave state in 1863? It's also a good question here that this person didn't ask. Why would you consider slavery to be the only cause of the Civil War when slavery was legal in the Union after the Civil War ended? Slavery wasn't ended until December of the year the Civil War ended, months after the war was over, with the passing of the 13th Amendment. And that's because there was still slavery in the Union. A lot of people cite Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation as the end of slavery, but that's just not true. That didn't free slaves anywhere. All that did was allow Union troops to free slaves and allow slaves who escaped from the South to come to the North and be freed because the thinking at the time, right, was that slavery is a major economic driver for the South. And by freeing the slaves in the South, by allowing Union troops to free slaves and allowing slaves to escape to the North to be freed, he was harming the South's economy. It was basically going after their war resources, right? Because if they didn't have slaves working in the farms, they'd have a harder time feeding their troops. But that's besides the point. Let's get back to this. So why did the public vote fail the first time in Tennessee, but not after Lincoln's call for troops? The rotund positron asks, well, that vote was before Fort Sumter and before Lincoln took office. Most Tennesseans believed the Union did not threaten slavery yet. It failed after Lincoln called for troops because Tennessee refused to invalidate fellow southern states. If Tennessee had simply said no to them and remained neutral, you'd have a great argument, but they didn't. They said no. And then they joined the pro-slavery side and then repeatedly cited slavery as their reason for leaving. West Virginia was accepted as a slave state out of military necessity. Lincoln even wrote that it was constitutionally questionable, but justified it as a wartime action. So it's okay as long as it's militarily necessary? A few counties in Appalachia was not a military necessity, as he imported around 1 million foreign soldiers to win his Marxist-backed war. 12% of Alabama's population didn't fight and die, so 5% of the people could own slaves. The fat electrician responds, I didn't say it was okay. Lincoln even acknowledged it probably wasn't okay, but the point is moot because it doesn't disprove that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It definitely shows some hypocrisy, absolutely, but it doesn't prove your point. I've answered multiple of your questions in detail detail? Now allow me to ask one. If Tennessee didn't secede over slavery, why did the governor and state government specifically cite it? Because although it was not the reason for secession, it was a concern among the few rich that did own slaves. However, the Confederate States agreed to emancipate slaves in order for recognition as an independent country. The governor, I'm assuming he means the governor and government, specifically cited it as a reason repeatedly. At no point did they say, I'm worried about slavery. The government said the election of a sectional president pledged to the destruction of our institutions leaves us no security for our property. If only a few plantation elites cared, then why did Tennessee voters flip their entire position after Lincoln's troop call? If they didn't mind the abolition of slavery, why would they decide to fight for it instead of against it? If they were truly just against the draft, they should have just refused, not joined the other side. Why did the governor, legislature, and secession commissioners say slavery was under attack? Why did Tennessee newspapers publish editorials warning of the extinction of slavery under Republican rule? To which somebody else responds, this is not the same guy as up here. Independent state of Scott, mixed McKinn County, over half of East Tennessee voted no to secession, means a lot of us weren't about it. Never mind, we had very little slaves in comparison to the antebellum states. I've warned you about this before, don't be biased. The fat electrician responds saying, I made a macro statement, the Civil War was over slavery. Showing small groups weren't in favor of slavery doesn't disprove that. Me saying that doesn't mean that everyone in the South was a pro-slavery racist either. It simply means that the Civil War was fought with the driving factor being slavery, much like World War II was fought over territorial expansion. Just because a lot of Americans fought in it for revenge doesn't change the fact that it was ultimately started and fought over regimes conquering land. Now, I do think that the fat electrician is right here, right? Slavery was a major portion of the reason for the Civil War, but I think he's focused in too hard on it, and it's not his fault. The entirety of academia and the historian class focuses on slavery because it's such an obvious and easy to explain reason for the Civil War. So when you try to research it, you look up anything, you very rarely see the other things that were the cause of it, and the other things that caused the Civil War were in conjunction with slavery. None of it would have happened without slavery being there, but slavery was only a contributor to the bigger cause. As we'll see here, somebody else responded with what I'm about to talk about. Nobody ever mentions the northern states and their tariff regime impacting the southern states, or they're bringing in foreigners for the factories, giving them more congressional seats, despite that nearly causing the Civil War years prior. To which the fat electrician responds, this still doesn't change my opinion, but it is one of the most compelling arguments I've ever heard. So kudos. I agree with this person here. I think it's stupid to disregard slavery as a cause of the Civil War, but I don't think that it was entirely the only cause of it. There was a ton of factors that came together, and it's not true to say that the Civil War was fought over slavery. It was fought over the economy. Slavery was a major portion of the economy, but it was the economy of the whole that was the cause of the Civil War, at least in my opinion. This whole thing starts way back when, decades before the Civil War, with the Tariff of Abominations. Now, this tariff was a very high tariff that very much upset the cotton farmers in the South, right? The major economic drivers of the South were the cotton farms, and they felt that they were being completely screwed over, and they weren't wrong, right? The tariffs, these things came in place after the War of 1812 and all sorts of stuff. It was a response to the fact that Europe had been blockaded for a long time because of a bunch of different wars being fought. I think the War of 1812, the Napoleonic Wars, and because people couldn't really sell things in Europe because they were fighting everywhere, and your ship might get sunk if you try to bring stuff into Britain. Stuff was being sold to the Americas at very cheap costs, and the tariffs, obviously being import taxes, was a big problem. As you see here, the tariff was set at 38% tax on some imported goods and a 45% tax on certain imported raw materials. Now, the farmers in the South believed that this directly impacted them, and it was hurting them because they imported all sorts of stuff for their plantations, for all the industry in the South. Meanwhile, up in the North, which was more industrialized, had factories, they had a problem with the cheap goods coming over from Europe because essentially the goods were cheaper than they could produce them for in America, which was causing people to buy European goods instead of American produced goods, which was negatively affecting the northern economy. So by passing the tariffs, they were trying to offset cheapness of European goods so that the people in the South would buy goods from the North. Now, you might note this was in 1828, right? So this is well before the Civil War, but this almost started its own Civil War. It was called the Nullification Crisis, and essentially it was when South Carolina decided they had enough, and they said, no, we're not doing that. We're not going to pay the Tariff of Abominations. We don't recognize this. We feel it's unconstitutional, it's null and void, and therefore we're not going to do it. Now, this became a major crisis at the time, obviously, because the nation was still new, right? The founding fathers were still presidents. I think it was John Adams. Yeah, it was John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson were still presidents at the time. And so this was very much a new nation, and already having an issue like this where one of the states was basically saying, we're not going to follow the laws. Well, that was a big problem, and it became a whole big thing. And there was almost a civil war fought over this back then. Eventually, though, it was settled peacefully, but the embers started in the nullification crisis never really went away. So when the outgoing president, James Buchanan, in 1861, decided that he was going to pass the Morrill Tariff, basically in his last days of the presidency, it became a big problem. The Morrill Tariff here was adopted on March 2nd, 1861. So if we go here, you'll see the Civil War started on April 12th, 1861, just a month later. Now, why is that? Well, of course, there's the aforementioned slavery issues. People in the North were becoming more and more against slavery, and that was already going to affect the Southern economy. At this point, though, they probably could have survived that. The South's economy would have been hurt a lot, but it's possible they ultimately could have figured it out. The moral tariff was seen as an act of northern aggression. Now, as a northerner myself, I kind of understand why they were pissed. The South saw themselves as not being fairly represented in Congress at the time, and that's because obviously the North had a bigger population, therefore they had more seats in the House. Of course, we see the Senate as being equal because every state gets 2 representatives, but at the time there were more states in the North, and it seemed to the South that they were being unfairly targeted by these northern politicians who passed this tariff. Now, this tariff was huge. You might remember when we talked about the tariff of abominations, we said it sets a 38% tax on some imported goods and a 45% tax on certain imported raw materials. Well, the moral tariff increased the effective rate collected on dutiable imports by approximately 70%. In 1860, tariff rates were among the lowest in the world and at historical lows by 19th century standards. The average rate from 1857 to 1860 being 17% overall. The moral tariffs raised those averages to about 26% overall or 36% on dutiable items. We're talking basically a 10% increase in the tariffs, essentially for protectionism to protect the factories in the North and American industry in the North, disproportionately affecting the South's economy. Now, this combined with slavery were the causes for the Civil War. It was not just one or the other. It was a combination of a ton of economic factors that all pushed the South to feel they were being unfairly treated and that they didn't have the representation they wanted. And again, you have to remember the 1860s when the Civil War was fought was not that far away from the founding of the country, right? And we founded our country in part because of unfair taxation. So at the time, the revolutionary spirit was still high. And when they saw more taxation without representation along with the economic impacts that were going to come from the loss of slavery, the South rebelled. Personally, I think when you say that slavery was the cause of the Civil War, you're not entirely incorrect. You're just not getting the full picture. The full picture was the Civil War was fought over economics and economic problems that I don't think the South ever really recovered from. There's a reason that the Northeast is still so much richer than a lot of the South. Where I grew up in the North, you know, education in the Civil War was focused on slavery. I mean, I was told in elementary school and middle school that the Emancipation Proclamation was what ended slavery. That's just not true. It's blatantly false. That's what my textbook said. I feel like it's an issue that we still haven't come to terms with as a country. We still haven't figured out how to talk about it. And the truth of the matter is there was a lot of problems that came up and caused the Civil War. It's like every war fought in human history. You can't just point to one issue and say that's what caused it. But it is so much easier to do that when something like slavery is involved because obviously slavery is abhorrent. It's horrible. Nobody wants that. So when you look back, it's easier to tell kids, hey, this is why we fought the Civil War. It was about slavery, because kids aren't going to know anything about economic sanctions and tariffs, right? And then those kids grow up and they think, oh yeah, the Civil War was about slavery, because it was in part, but then they never learn about the economic problems that also helped lead up into it. And those kids grow up, they write the textbooks, and bada bing, bada boom, eventually history's lost a lot of the detail. And I think the detail is something that needs to come back, because if we don't pay attention to the past, we are doomed to repeat it. And there's a lot of economic problems in modern America, not exactly anything that's entirely relatable to the Civil War, but stuff that is, you know, getting concerning. So I think it's important that we focus not just on the slavery cause of the Civil War, but also the total economic cause, of which slavery was part of it, but not the only thing. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I don't think the fat electrician was wrong. I just think he only got part of the answer. No hate towards him. I'm a big fan of the fat electrician, obviously. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Am I right? Am I completely wrong? Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching all the way till the end. Remember to like and subscribe. Have a great day, and God bless you.